Welcome to All-Time Epic Stories. Today, we present, The Lost City of El Dorado, a quest for gold and inhuman resilience. In the year 1535, the Spanish Empire stood at the pinnacle of global power, its coffers overflowing with New World treasures. Yet within the hearts of conquistadors, an insatiable hunger burned brighter than any flame. Whispers of a legend traveled through colonial outposts like wildfire. Indigenous peoples spoke of a sacred ceremony where a king covered himself in gold dust and plunged into a mountain lake as an offering to the gods. The tale evolved with each retelling, transforming from a ritual into an entire kingdom of gold. El Dorado, they called it. The Golden One. A city where streets were paved with precious metal and temples gleamed under the tropical sun. Captain Sebastián de Belalcázar was among the first to succumb to the obsession. A veteran of Pizarro's conquest of Peru, he had already tasted the intoxicating power of plundered riches, but it was never enough. In 1536, Belalcázar assembled an expedition of 300 men. They departed from Quito with horses, war dogs, and the absolute certainty that glory awaited them beyond the eastern mountains. The Andes tested them immediately. Narrow mountain passes gave way beneath their feet. Altitude sickness claimed men and horses alike. The cold at night was so severe that sentries were found frozen at their posts come dawn. Yet Belalcázar drove them onward with promises of unimaginable wealth. He spoke of golden statues the size of men, of emerald mines that would make them all kings in their own right. Greed became their fuel when strength failed. Descending the eastern slopes, they entered a realm unlike anything in their experience. The cloud forest wrapped around them like a living entity, vegetation so dense that machetes dulled within hours. Insects became their constant tormentors. Mosquitoes descended in clouds so thick they could barely breathe. Men scratched their skin raw, and festering wounds became commonplace. Still, they pressed forward. The first to die from disease was a young soldier named Rodrigo, barely 18 years old. They buried him in the jungle mud without ceremony. There would be hundreds more before the expedition's end. Indigenous peoples watched from the shadows, neither hostile nor welcoming. They had seen Spanish greed before and knew it would be its own punishment. The jungle would do their work for them. Meanwhile, in Bogotá, another expedition was forming. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada had conquered the Muisca people and heard their legends firsthand. He became convinced that El Dorado lay somewhere in the unexplored eastern lowlands. Quesada was different from other conquistadors. Educated, calculating, he approached the quest with the precision of a scholar rather than the recklessness of a fortune hunter. This made him more dangerous, not less. He organized his expedition with military efficiency. 500 men, carefully selected. Supplies for a year-long campaign. Indigenous guides who claimed to know the way to the Golden Kingdom. The guides, however, told Quesada what he wanted to hear, weaving elaborate tales of cities beyond the mountains. They had learned that survival depended on feeding Spanish fantasies while leading them in circles. As Quesada's expedition penetrated deeper into the llanos, the terrain transformed into endless grasslands. The horizon stretched to infinity, offering no shelter from the merciless sun or sudden torrential rains. Water became scarce, then non-existent. Men's tongues swelled in their mouths. They drank from stagnant pools that brought dysentery and fever. Horses collapsed and were butchered for moisture in their blood. Yet Quesada maintained iron discipline. When men spoke of turning back, he reminded them of the fortune that awaited. When they despaired, he read to them from chronicles of past conquests. His will became their chain. In Europe, the legend of El Dorado was taking on a life of its own. Cartographers marked it on maps with increasing confidence. Writers embellished the tale with fantastic details that bore no resemblance to any indigenous account. The German merchant house of Welser had been granted rights to explore Venezuela by the Spanish crown. They sent their own expedition under the command of Ambrosius Ehinger, a man whose brutality would become legendary. Ehinger's method was simple and savage. He would raid indigenous villages, enslave the inhabitants, and force them to reveal the location of gold. When they had no gold to give, he assumed they were lying and increased the torture. He penetrated deep into the interior, leaving a trail of devastation. Entire peoples fled at news of his approach. Others fought and died. But none could tell him what he wanted to hear, because El Dorado existed only in European imagination. In 1533, Ehinger was struck by a poisoned arrow during one of his raids. He died slowly over 9 days, delirious and raving about golden cities. His men buried him in an unmarked grave and retreated in disorder. His successor, George von Speyer, proved equally ruthless but more methodical. He organized expeditions into the Andes with Germanic efficiency, documenting everything while showing no mercy to those who impeded his progress. Von Speyer's expedition of 1535 would become one of the most grueling in the annals of exploration. 400 men departed. 3 years later, fewer than 80 would return, broken in body and spirit. They crossed the Cordillera Oriental during the worst of the rainy season. Landslides buried men alive. Rivers swollen beyond recognition swept away pack animals and supplies. The mountains themselves seemed to reject their presence. In the cloud forests beyond, they encountered indigenous peoples who had never seen Europeans. Some greeted them with curiosity. Others attacked on sight, having heard tales of Spanish cruelty carried by refugees from the coast. Von Speyer employed interpreters and torture interchangeably. He would enter villages with gifts, then demand gold. When none was produced, the gifts became chains and the questions became interrogations conducted with hot iron and blade. Yet even extreme cruelty could not conjure gold where none existed. The indigenous peoples of these regions worked in stone and wood, creating art of profound beauty but no value in European eyes. Back in the Llanos, Quesada's expedition had reached the edge of catastrophe. Supplies exhausted, men dying daily, no gold found. His officers urged retreat. Quesada ordered them forward, convinced that the Golden City lay just beyond the next river. Then, miraculously, they found it. Not El Dorado, but something real, the territories of the Muisca people, who indeed worked in gold. Quesada's eyes gleamed with vindication, though what he found would never match what he had imagined. The Muisca civilization was sophisticated, their goldwork exquisite. They created delicate figurines and ceremonial objects of breathtaking artistry. But they were not El Dorado. They were real people with a real culture, soon to be destroyed. Quesada conquered them with ruthless efficiency. He melted down their sacred objects, divided the gold among his men, and wrote to the Spanish crown describing his discovery as merely the gateway to greater treasures beyond. The indigenous accounts of the Gilded King's ceremony had been true, but Quesada refused to accept that it was merely a ritual. He interrogated Muisca elders relentlessly, certain they were hiding the location of the actual Golden City. The elders, bewildered by Spanish greed, tried to explain that the ceremony took place at Lake Guatavita. The gold was an offering to the gods, sunk in the sacred waters. This only inflamed Quesada's imagination further. He immediately organized an expedition to drain the lake. Using indigenous labor and Spanish engineering, they attempted to empty the sacred waters to claim the fortune that supposedly lay at the bottom. They succeeded in lowering the water level and recovered a few small golden objects, but the mud at the bottom proved too deep and unstable. Men sank into it and had to be hauled out. The project was abandoned, but the obsession was not. While Quesada plundered the Muisca, another expedition was forming in Peru. Francisco de Orellana had served with Pizarro and now sought his own glory. He would lead one of the most extraordinary journeys in exploration history. Orellana's expedition departed in 1541, ostensibly searching for cinnamon forests but truly seeking El Dorado. They crossed the Andes and descended into the Amazon basin, entering a realm that would test the limits of human endurance. The Amazon river system was unlike anything Europeans had encountered. Rivers the size of seas, forests so vast they seemed infinite, and indigenous peoples who had developed complex civilizations in this seemingly hostile environment. Orellana built boats from jungle timber and committed to following the river wherever it led. It was madness or genius, depending on perspective. His men had no choice but to follow, as retreat had become impossible. They encountered indigenous communities who sometimes traded, sometimes fought. One group of female warriors attacked so fiercely that Orellana named the river after the Amazons of Greek mythology, a name that would endure. For 8 months they traveled, suffering constant hunger, disease, and attacks. Men died from infected wounds, from poisoned arrows, from simply giving up. Yet Orellana drove them onward with the promise of discovering El Dorado at the river's end. They emerged, finally, at the Atlantic Ocean, becoming the first Europeans to traverse the South American continent. They had not found El Dorado, but they had accomplished something no golden city could match, an impossible journey completed through sheer human will. Yet when Orellana returned to Spain, he spoke not of his incredible achievement but of golden cities he claimed to have seen from a distance. The obsession had survived even when everything else had been stripped away. The legend of El Dorado had by now consumed dozens of expeditions and thousands of lives. Yet each failure only seemed to confirm the city's existence. After all, something so difficult to find must be truly extraordinary. In 1560, Pedro de Ursua organized what would become the most nightmarish expedition yet. He recruited criminals and malcontents, men who had nothing to lose. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster came with precision. Among them was Lope de Aguirre, a man whose madness would become legendary. Scarred, paranoid, and brilliant in his way, Aguirre saw the expedition as his chance not for gold but for something darker, a kingdom of his own making. The expedition descended into the Amazon with 500 men. Within months, discipline collapsed. Ursua proved too weak to control his recruits, especially as hunger and hardship transformed them into something barely human. On New Year's Day 1561, Aguirre led a mutiny. They murdered Ursua in his tent while he slept with his mistress. The killing was brutal, efficient, and marked the beginning of one of history's most bizarre rebellions. Aguirre declared himself in rebellion against the Spanish crown. He would find El Dorado, he announced, and create a kingdom where he answered to no king. His men, having crossed the line into murder, had little choice but to follow. What followed was a reign of terror upon the river. Aguirre killed anyone who questioned him, including his own lieutenants. He attacked indigenous villages not for gold but for the pure expression of violence. He had become the monster the jungle created. His men began deserting when possible, fleeing into the jungle to take their chances with indigenous peoples rather than continue under Aguirre's madness. He had those he caught publicly tortured as examples. Aguirre wrote letters to the Spanish king, rambling manifestos of grievance and grandiosity. He signed them Lope de Aguirre, Wrath of God, Prince of Freedom. History has rarely seen such a perfect union of ambition and insanity. Eventually his expedition reached the Atlantic, as Orellana's had before. But where Orellana had achieved something great, Aguirre had only demonstrated how far men could fall. He turned north to Venezuela, still seeking his impossible kingdom. In Venezuela, he attempted to raise rebellion among Spanish colonists. Instead, they hunted him. Trapped in a coastal town with fewer than 20 loyal followers, Aguirre made his final, terrible choice. Rather than let his daughter be captured and face shame, he killed her himself. Then he walked out to face his executioners, dying in a hail of bullets while cursing the king. His quest for El Dorado had led only to this, complete moral annihilation. Yet even Aguirre's horrific end did not kill the legend. If anything, it fed it. Men reasoned that only something truly valuable could drive others to such extremes. The search continued, generation after generation. Sir Walter Raleigh, the English adventurer, became obsessed with El Dorado in the 1590s. He led expeditions to the Orinoco River, convinced that the Golden City lay in the Guiana highlands. His journals mix careful observation with wild speculation. Raleigh encountered indigenous peoples who told him of cities inland. He chose to interpret their accounts as confirmation of El Dorado rather than description of actual communities. Confirmation bias had become an epidemic among treasure seekers. He returned to England with samples of gold ore and tales of a lake larger than the English Channel, its shores paved with gold. Queen Elizabeth was intrigued but cautious. She gave him limited support for a return expedition. Raleigh's second expedition in 1617 would be his last. King James I had forbidden conflict with Spanish territories, but Raleigh's men attacked a Spanish settlement. His son was killed in the fighting. The quest had claimed another generation. Raleigh returned to England empty-handed and in disgrace. King James, under pressure from Spain, ordered his execution. On the scaffold, Raleigh's last words were of El Dorado, the dream that had destroyed him but that he could not renounce even at death's door. The search moved into the scientific age, but science did not diminish the obsession. Alexander von Humboldt, the great naturalist, explored the Orinoco in 1800, partially motivated by El Dorado legends despite his rational training. Humboldt documented indigenous cultures with unprecedented care and respect. He recognized that their accounts described real places and real customs, not fairy tales. Yet even he could not completely resist speculating about undiscovered golden cities. His scientific reports did more to demystify the Amazon than any previous account. Yet paradoxically, by revealing how much remained unknown, he also inspired a new generation of treasure hunters to venture into the unmapped regions. In the 19th century, the El Dorado quest merged with colonial expansion. Nations justified their invasions of indigenous territories by claiming to search for lost cities and ancient treasures. Greed wore the mask of science and progress. Rubber barons in the Amazon claimed to be searching for El Dorado even as they enslaved indigenous peoples to harvest latex. The legend had become a convenient excuse for atrocities committed in the name of commerce. Percy Fawcett, the British explorer, became the 20th century's most famous El Dorado seeker. A decorated soldier and surveyor, he spent years in the Amazon and became convinced that an advanced ancient civilization lay hidden in the jungle. Fawcett called his quarry Z and claimed to have clues from indigenous accounts and Portuguese documents. Unlike earlier seekers, he believed the city's inhabitants would be sophisticated, not merely wealthy. His obsession had an almost mystical quality. In 1925, Fawcett departed on his final expedition with his adult son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel. They ventured into the unexplored Mato Grosso region. Their last message spoke confidently of success. Then, silence. Fawcett and his companions were never seen again. Their disappearance sparked one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century and launched dozens of rescue expeditions, several of which also vanished. The jungle had claimed more victims to the El Dorado curse. Theories proliferated about their fate. Some claimed they were killed by indigenous peoples defending their territory. Others suggested they found their city and chose to stay. The most likely explanation was disease or accident, mundane ends to an extraordinary quest. Modern archaeology has revealed that Fawcett was partially right. The Amazon did host advanced civilizations with large populations and sophisticated earthworks. But they were not golden cities, they were complex societies that managed the forest through knowledge, not precious metal. LiDAR technology in the 21st century has pierced the jungle canopy, revealing extensive networks of pre-Columbian settlements. The revelation is profound. El Dorado was not a single city but an entire civilization, destroyed by European diseases before most Europeans ever saw it. The indigenous peoples who encountered early Europeans were survivors of a demographic catastrophe. Their accounts of great cities were not legends but memories. The searchers had been looking for something that had already been destroyed by their own arrival. The true El Dorado, then, was not a place that needed to be discovered but one that needed to be understood. The wealth was not in gold but in the sophisticated knowledge of how to thrive in the Amazon, a knowledge largely lost when the people who held it perished. Yet the legend persists in popular culture. Films, novels, and games continue to depict El Dorado as a magical golden city waiting to be found. The myth has become more powerful than any reality could be. The psychology behind the El Dorado quest reveals something profound about human nature. We are drawn to the idea that just beyond the known world lies something that will transform us, that will finally be enough. The Golden City represents the eternal more that haunts ambition. Economic historians have calculated the cost of the El Dorado expeditions: tens of thousands of lives, fortunes spent, empires strained. The return on investment was essentially zero in monetary terms, though the geographic knowledge gained was invaluable. The expeditions did produce accurate maps, botanical specimens, and ethnographic records. Science benefited from obsession, though at a price that no ethical calculation could justify. Knowledge built on graves has an unsettling foundation. For the indigenous peoples of South America, the El Dorado legend meant centuries of invasion, enslavement, and cultural destruction. They were the true victims of the quest, caught between their actual history and European fantasies. Some indigenous communities deliberately fed European fantasies, describing golden cities always just a bit farther away, leading expeditions in circles until they gave up and left. Survival sometimes required becoming complicit in the very myths that endangered them. The actual source of the El Dorado legend, the Muisca ceremony at Lake Guatavita, was an act of spiritual devotion. The Gilded King was not displaying wealth but demonstrating surrender to powers greater than himself. Europeans fundamentally misunderstood the symbolism. Modern attempts to drain Lake Guatavita have recovered various golden objects, but the engineering challenges remain immense. The lake seems to guard its secrets, mud and water flowing back to reclaim what humans try to excavate. The environmental cost of El Dorado seeking was massive. Forests were burned to clear paths. Rivers were diverted. Wildlife was hunted to extinction in some regions. The search for gold left scars on the landscape that remain visible today. Yet perhaps the greatest cost was moral. The quest for El Dorado revealed how easily civilized men could become monsters when greed was unleashed. It stripped away the veneer of European superiority and exposed the savage heart beneath fine armor. Some of the expedition leaders recognized what they had become. Their journals contain moments of clarity, passages where they saw themselves as they truly were. But recognition did not lead to change. The momentum of obsession was too great. The line between exploration and exploitation has always been blurred. The El Dorado seekers exemplified this confusion, genuinely believing they were engaged in a noble quest while committing acts that would be judged as crimes against humanity by any modern standard. Modern treasure hunters still seek El Dorado, though now they use metal detectors and GPS. They are often prosecuted for looting archaeological sites. The quest has been criminalized, but the allure remains as powerful as ever. The rise of responsible archaeology has reframed the search. Scientists now seek to understand pre-Columbian civilizations on their own terms, not as sources of treasure but as complex societies worthy of respect and study. Indigenous communities are reclaiming their own histories, rejecting the El Dorado narrative and asserting the truth of what their ancestors built and knew. This is perhaps the final chapter in the legend, the truth replacing the fantasy. Yet the metaphor of El Dorado persists in our language and thinking. We still chase golden opportunities, still believe that the next venture will be the one that finally satisfies our hunger. The pattern repeats in new forms. The cryptocurrency boom, the space race, the search for breakthrough technologies, all bear traces of the El Dorado mentality. The location changes, but the psychology remains. Something transformative lies just beyond our current reach. Social scientists study El Dorado seekers as case studies in obsession, group psychology, and decision-making under extreme conditions. The expeditions provide data on how humans behave when normal social constraints dissolve. Philosophers have found in El Dorado a perfect example of how desire creates its own reality. The city existed because men believed in it so fiercely that they reshaped the world, and themselves, around that belief. The environmental movement has adopted El Dorado as a cautionary tale about the cost of exploitation. The Amazon rainforest itself has become the real treasure, more valuable alive than any amount of gold could be. Artists and writers continue to be inspired by the El Dorado story, seeing in it themes of human ambition, folly, and the collision of cultures. The legend has transcended its historical origins to become a universal narrative. Perhaps the deepest lesson of El Dorado is about the nature of enough. The seekers could never find their golden city because they would never have recognized it as sufficient. Their hunger was infinite, and no finite treasure could satisfy it. The real El Dorado, then, exists not in the jungle but in the human heart. It is the dream that drives us beyond our limits, for better and worse. It is the belief that somewhere, somehow, we will find what we are looking for. And so the quest continues, though its form has changed. We no longer search for a city of gold in the Amazon, but we still search. The names and places change, but the fundamental human drive remains, to find something that will finally, completely, transform us. The story of El Dorado is ultimately a mirror. In its pursuit, we see reflected our greatest virtues, courage, persistence, curiosity, and our deepest flaws, greed, cruelty, self-deception. It asks us to consider, what are we still chasing, and what are we willing to sacrifice to catch it? The quest for El Dorado claimed thousands of lives and lasted centuries, driven by a legend that transformed simple ritual into impossible dream. In seeking cities of gold, explorers revealed the true treasure, understanding the limits of ambition and the cost of obsession. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, remember, the greatest treasures are often not the ones we seek, but the wisdom we gain from the seeking.